Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, or good morning if you are joining us from the States in breakfast time. Warm welcome to our today discussion on democracy measuring in Central and Eastern Europe and on the policy relevance of democracy measuring in the European Union. I am warmly welcoming our distinguished speakers, Zselyke Csáky from Freedom House, Sabine from Bertelsmann Transformation Index, and Juraj Medzihorsky from V-Dem. My name is Hegedüs, and I serve as Fellow for Central Europe at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. I think it's fair to say that global democracy has been in decline for 15 years now, with the Central and Eastern European countries like Hungary or Poland leading the trend of democratic decline and autocratization in the Western world, at least during the last decade. And in spite of all their differences in methodology and focus, nearly all large democracy measuring projects agree on that trend. Still, one can get the impression that the results delivered by highly renowned democracy measuring projects are largely disregarded at political and policy levels when it comes to the questions of the EU's internal democracy and rule of law crisis. The term autocratization is banned from the European discourse. Countries that are deemed as non-democracies by key democracy indices are treated at the European stage as full-fledged democracies with only some minor shortcomings. This behavior ultimately boosts the democratic legitimacy of autocratizing barely democratic or non-democratic regimes. We see these narratives to prevail both in the internal and external EU context. In the case of Hungary and Poland, just as like with regard to the stabilocracies of the Western Balkan candidate countries like Serbia, for example. What are the major democratic and authoritarian trends and lessons learned in Central and Eastern Europe that European politicians and stakeholders shouldn't ignore? Why are the results of different efforts to measure democracy falling on deaf ears and remaining largely disregarded by European politics? When and why did measuring democracy lose its political and policy relevance, and how could this be reestablished? Or adding perhaps a further normative perspective to the consideration, should it be reestablished? Should democracy measuring have a policy relevance at all? I am extremely delighted that we can discuss these questions with our speakers today. Zselyke Csáky is the Research Director for Europe and Eurasia at Freedom House and works on Nations in Transit, Freedom House's annual survey of democracy from Central Europe to Central Asia. She has written extensively on democratic governance in Central Europe and the Balkans and co-hosted In Between Europe, a podcast focusing on the region. Prior to joining Freedom House, she served as researcher at Amnesty International, the International Service for Human Rights, and at the European Parliament. Sabine is senior expert at the Bertelsmann Stiftung and director of BTI, Bertelsmann Transformation Index project. She has been responsible for conceptualizing and coordinating the Transformation Index, a global survey on the state of democracy, market economy, and good governance in 137 transformation countries since the project's inception in 2001. Sabine holds an MA in Political Science, German Literature, and Slavic Studies from the University of Freiburg. And prior to joining the Bertelsmann Stiftung, she worked as a freelance journalist for German newspapers and radio stations. Her main areas of research are good governance and democratization, with a special focus on the former Soviet Union countries. She has been also a member of the Innovation Council of the German Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development. And Juraj Medzihorsky is an LSE Fellow in the Department of Methodology and a Senior Research Associate at the Varieties of Democracy Institute, the University of Gothenburg, also known as V-Dem. He received his PhD in political science from the Central European University and works mainly on questions of elections, democratization, autocratization, and international political competition. Zselyke, Sabine, Juraj, thank you all for joining us today. Regarding the housekeeping rules, we will have 2 statement rounds at the beginning, with the individual statements limited to 5 minutes each. Roughly after 45 minutes, we will open the Q&A, and I would like to encourage you all, ladies and gentlemen, to send me your questions via the Q&A or the chat function of the Zoom. Both are working. I will either bunch together your questions and forward them to your speakers, or I will unmute you that you can ask your question in person. I also would like to remind you that the event is recorded and it will be available online at the YouTube channel of the German Marshall Fund. And having said that, I would like to pass the floor to Zselyke Csáky. Zselyke, what are the main trends and dynamics of democratization and autocratization in Central and Eastern Europe, according to Freedom House? The floor is yours.
Thank you, Daniel, and thank you to the German Marshall Fund for inviting me to this interesting panel. Let me try to share my screen, and then I will walk you through the trends that we are seeing in this region. I hope you can see my starting slide and everything is okay. Just give me a thumbs up if you can. Okay, great. Fantastic. So today I will be using one of our annual reports, Nations in Transit. We have other global reports that focus on the region, but this is the report that specifically deals with Central and Eastern Europe, as well as Eurasia. And as you can see, I mean, the name says that this report started after the transitions. So its value is in having a time series on the one hand that shows these trends, and having some comparative data as well as reports. So today we will be talking about the scores, but I think it's important to say that we also have reports which go from 5 to up until 10,000 words that discuss these developments and go into broader detail. So as you can see here on this map, which is from last year, because our most up-to-date data is actually coming out in 2 weeks, so stay tuned for that. But this is from last year. As you can see here, this report has 5 categories, going from consolidated democracies to consolidated authoritarian regimes. And in Central Europe and in the Balkans, which we are discussing today, most of the countries are characterized as democracies or as hybrid regimes. In fact, the hybrid regimes, that category itself, has doubled in size over the past decade or so. So that's an important and interesting change. But to go into more detail about the countries, so this is a slide, or this is a chart that might be familiar from last year to some of you, because this was the big news last year. Nations in Transit is a fairly conservative tool. It changes quite slowly, and we have been criticized for that. So it's very significant when countries change category. And this is what you can see here, is that last year, 4 countries, or last year and the previous year, 4 countries changed categories. Poland left the group of consolidated democracies here. And Hungary, Serbia, and Montenegro fully left the group of democracies. Hungary starting from a consolidated democracy a decade ago, Serbia and Montenegro sort of in the semi-consolidated group and changing slowly, and then shifting into the group of hybrid regimes last year. And so looking at things from a broader regional perspective, which includes all the countries that are part of this survey, I think what is really important to emphasize is just how big the shift has been in Hungary and Poland, in the 2 countries that I think we should be talking mostly about today. So you can see the 10-year comparison here, the 10-year changes. And of course, this can be a little bit misleading because these countries started from a higher point. For example, Kazakhstan or Turkmenistan, which is actually the worst performing country in our survey, hasn't changed that much. But still, I think it shows just the magnitude of the change over the past decade. You can see Hungary's shift being the largest, but Poland following it quite closely. And then, of course, in the top 5 or top 6, we also have Serbia. We also have Bulgaria. I think at the same time, it's interesting and important to note that the Czech Republic is not in the top 5. Slovakia is even further away. So in those countries, things have gotten somewhat worse over the past decade, but those declines were much smaller. and they were limited in time. So for example, in Slovakia, it will be interesting to see what happens after the change in government last year. And then just to go into more detail on Hungary and Poland. So these are the 7 categories that this report evaluates. As you can see, this is democratic institutions in the broadest sense possible. So this includes elected state institutions, such as national democratic governance, local democratic governance, but it also includes non-elected state institutions, such as the judiciary, and it also includes institutions in the broad sense. We like to call them institutions, such as civil society or the media. So this report is not a minimalist understanding of democracy. It's not just about elections. This is broader than that. But it's clear in Poland's case that you can see that the changes started after Law and Justice came into power, and it has been sliding down in our rankings since then. At the same time, I think it's important to emphasize that if you look at the categories or the indicators that we evaluate, it's mostly the judicial framework and independence category that has slid, as well as the independent media one. And I think we can go into details if people are interested in that, but I think just today's Constitutional Tribunal decision related to the Ombudsman is an example of why this shift has been so great in Poland's case. And then finally, let me end on a chart showing Hungary. So you can see that here the scores are lower. The scale is the same. The scores are lower. And Hungary has been sliding down the scale since 2011 here, but in fact, that's not on this chart. On our index, it has been declining since 2005 or 6. So before Fidesz came into power, this has been a longer trend. But what you see here is that each and every category has been implicated that we are evaluating, ranging from national democratic governance to local democratic governance to the judiciary to media. So the transformation, if you will, has been much broader and much bigger than in Poland. And of course, that's a very important difference between the two countries. And that also just shows that Hungary has by now in our index left the group of democracies last year. So I will stop there and yes, try to end the screen sharing because I think we will discuss these in detail and there is a lot of data to understand. But I think we should go into detail on Hungary and Poland as well, but also just the broader regional phenomenon. So I'm curious to hear what my colleagues are saying and then curious to discuss the political and policy relevance.
Thank you so much, Zselyke. If you allow me a rather speculative, immediate follow-up question. You mentioned that Nations in Transit has a very solid qualitative arm as well. So based on this qualitative analysis and data, what you provide, can you say something about the reversibility of that very impressive democratic breakdown, what the figures demonstrate in the case of Poland and Hungary?
Thank you. So that's actually a very big question. I'm not sure we have time to discuss it fully, but I think so. Based on our survey, we have seen Nations in Transit is really a catalog of reform efforts. So we have seen similar negative changes in many countries. We haven't seen changes that have been this big since Nations in Transit has been around. So in that sense, I think our report might not be useful in terms of looking at past examples. What we have seen is that there are countries that are in the hybrid regime category that have sort of managed to recover some of the damage that has been done to democratic institutions. One example is North Macedonia, where the Gruevski government was in power for a decade. The changes actually were quite similar to the changes in Hungary. and the damage was somewhat smaller on our scale, but quite similar. And so there is a new government in power for a few years. They have been able to start on some of the reforms, but they haven't really seen a full reversal. I think, yes, that's a question that needs to be discussed in and of itself, and perhaps we don't yet have good examples, even if this report is about transitions.
Thank you so much, Zselyke. So then I think it's fair to summarize it in the way that there is a way out of state capture, but it's slow and difficult. Ms. Donna, BTI is covering also the questions of economic transformation and good governance, and therefore it is a slightly different approach to the measuring of democratic transformation or autocratization than its peers. What are the key takes of BTI on the region? And perhaps also a unique question or a follow-up question, but I'm asking it now. How did the democratic decline impact good governance in Central and Eastern Europe, according to your figures? Ms. Donner, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the invitation. I'm honored to sit on this panel with distinguished colleagues from even more distinguished similar exercises than we are doing, monitoring instruments. Directly to your question, I'm not going deep into methodology. We, everyone who is listening can approach us for that afterwards. I think the approach and the economic trends do play a role, and I will come to that. I will share my screen as well. I focus on the democratic experience here and on the democratic sides, and I expect that all of us will not, differ in general with the general trends that we are observing. But just to give you an introduction, what our takes are for the region. The backsliding, the democratic decline that we have been seeing is something that we have observed from our edition in the BTI 2008. So that's slightly more than a decade. That was sort of the level of the highest level of consolidation, democratic consolidation that we saw in the region. There are not many good news to share. If you take a global perspective, the region is still the most democratic region in the world. But on the other hand, and I'm immediately coming to the negative, also Eastern Europe, Southeastern Europe, the region is the region together with Latin America that has been digressing the most over the past decade. And of course, that is a trend that is very worrisome, because particularly the consolidating democracies that we are seeing here, that's a picture of 2008 actually, and the quality, the democratic quality we observed, the region is still fully democratic, and there are consolidating democracies, the farthest advanced democracies. Most of the countries, except for the Balkan regions, have been already in that category in 2008. And the defective and highly defective democracies, there was no highly defective democracy, but the defective democracies were the accession countries mostly. If we switch, same picture, to the situation in 2020, and there's a caveat, our BTI is published every second year or every 2 years. So these data is from the beginning of 2019. We're currently updating and preparing the next edition. So some might be slightly outdated, and I'm not expecting any changes to the better actually. But as you can see, there are only now 7 consolidating democracies left. All others have been digressing over the past decade and are now categorized in the BTI as defective democracies. I think that is worth mentioning, because when I come exactly to what happened here and why do we not maybe not record the changes, or they don't have the impact in the political world that we would like them to see, is I think we sort of have been, that includes the academia to up to a certain point, but certainly also the political sphere. There is some sort of almost failure of imagination that consolidated democracies was actually regress towards less democracy, and that not, by military coup that we have seen in the past, but very gradual, a very gradual retreat. If we're looking, and that is very similar to what we just saw from Freedom House, if you're looking at what are the main drivers of the deterioration, the criteria, rule of law, and political participations, and you see the development in some of these indicators. Those are the main drivers of the deterioration. Again, if we had this discussion in the, I don't know, late 90s, probably we wouldn't have expected that in the very core categories of democracy, consolidated countries would sort of retreat on those exactly, which means quality of elections, association assembly rights, particularly the separation of powers and independent judiciary, not only in the cases of Poland and Hungary, but also in other countries like Serbia, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not going deep into these details. I think that was a surprise. It shouldn't be anymore, because this is, as you can see in all of these indicators, it's a continuous trend, but it's also a very gradual trend. So this is one of the reasons the title of this meeting is "Do Scores Matter?" It is part of the reason why we decided that our methodological approach will not stop at the scores. I think they matter, but to see these gradual changes and actually make sense of them is something that does not translate immediately into the scores, but is something that I think qualitative assessments capture better, in a sense, and earlier probably. And it might also, and that's up for discussion in the second round, might also be one of the reasons why they are not as detectable as score changes, category changes from democracies to autocracies or other regimes. And I think one of the exciting things about a discussion like this is how could we improve to sort of make that more detectable. I want to conclude by showing you one of the, and I think I'm pretty sure we would all more or less agree on that as well. What we see from those changes in past decades is also that there is a pattern of democratic backsliding in not only Eastern European countries, that transcends regions at the moment. Not a perfectly academic kind of pattern, but there is a generally an anti-elitism and us versus them agenda. Usually the societies that we are looking at, and that's something that shows in our governance trends as well, is more polarized than it used to be. Political leadership is less able to mediate conflicts in between societal groups, etc. So that gives an opening to a very strong us versus them agenda. As we see, and Hungary and Poland are sort of the cases that probably Hungary was probably the model case for that. It usually starts with undermining not only the judicial institutions, but also oversight institutions that are supposed to keep power to account, that are supposed to play a very independent role in the separation of powers. This happens, as we see in countries across the region, by politicizing the judiciary, by staffing oversight institutions with very loyal staff, etc., going after opponents, changing, of course, the setup of the institutions, not particularly abolishing them altogether, but sort of changing them from within, hollowing them out by that. The one part, that's one part I just mentioned about the gradual change. You know, when does this register in scores that that are not necessarily as fine-grained as we would like them probably to be, because numbers cannot express that. In parallel, you know, muzzling the media, also not by outright censorship, which would be easily detectable, but by sort of reducing the pluralism that is in a given in the media environment and landscape. Also, Hungary has been one of the model cases for that, and is copied worldwide. How to do that at the moment by Poland, particularly. You know, self-censorship is one of the things going after, with, you know, with the help of the politicized judiciary going after journalists, but also the buyout of media by government, close state companies. Restricting civil society activity is something that usually comes a bit later because it's more obvious. But again, also a lot by rhetoric and defamation that happens a lot. The next then somewhat more decisive step and visible step is the manipulation actually of elections. Also not by, you know, very grave visible things like ballot box stuffing, but more by changing, by gerrymandering on one part, but also by changing legislation, and like before, by staffing election commissions with loyal governance, loyal people, etc., etc. The last step would be, and Hungary has already done that, is revising the constitution actually to sort of make the changes irreversible, or even more difficult to reverse once that happened. All the while, the polarization of a society has to be perpetuated by that model. I think the power dynamics of this model make it inevitable that there is a high polarization in any given society. And of course, continued marginalizing the opposition. So that's just some of the patterns as an introduction, just by trying to answer your questions as concise as possible. Of course, if you're looking at what happened, there is an economic, social side to this reaction, because while we are looking at the current leadership in those countries, of course, there has been previous leadership and promises and reforms that haven't been tackled. So as in other cases, this is sometimes it's a symptom and not the source for the disease sometimes. So I think particularly in that reason, one of the reasons why populist, autocratic leaning governments came into power is also because there was a big dissatisfaction by the citizens with the unfulfilled promise of EU accession, you know, by raising the living standards to the average of the other European citizens. Let's not forget the crisis in 2010, the global financial crisis hit particularly hard in that region and led to the fact that when we look at the catch up that happened, that the pre-crisis level in many areas is not yet reached, etc., etc. In governance, we see that the biggest impact of these changes that I just mentioned is by disregarding meritocratic standards to staff authorities and bureaucracy. That is usually something that we see that tends to impact governance a lot, because the implementation capacities, the steering capabilities of a government are affected by that. We see that not only in Hungary, but also in Turkey, for example. The fact that you get rid of the most qualified and try to get the most loyal people in charge with implementing your policy agenda doesn't usually help in actually implementing it. So we see that. We also see that, as I just mentioned, the need for constantly perpetuating the polarization in society by playing identity politics, etc., of course, leads also to the fact that it is even more difficult to, and it's not even wanted, to mediate conflict between different strata of society. And of course, within the region, primarily in Hungary and Poland, but also in Serbia and other countries, we see that international cooperation, which is something that we add to the it's part of the BTI examination, the credibility and the capacity to interact and to cooperate on an international level is affected quite dramatically. So I'll leave it at that, and looking forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Ms. Donner, for your take, and especially many thanks for this summarizing of the key substantial patterns of autocratization in the region. Juraj, turning to you. V-Dem has a remarkable and rather unique quantitative methodology in comparison to its peers, which peers, as we already mentioned, can be rather considered as qualitative research projects, even if they assign scores to their various indices. How do V-Dem's findings compare in light of these methodological differences to those of the other projects? You have the floor.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you for the question and for the introduction. To answer your question, I would like to share with you a set of figures that simultaneously show the story of the region as recorded in the V-Dem data, but they also give an idea of how detailed a picture one can get from V-Dem's data is. Now, each of these figures was produced by an online graphic interface, which is freely accessible on V-Dem's website. So anyone can go there and make figures like these. On each of these figures, on the horizontal dimension, we see the state 21 years ago. And on the vertical, we see the state last year. Now, if a country is below the diagonal, it means that it is now worse off than it was 20 years ago. And if it's above the diagonal, it means it's better off than it was 20 years ago. And if a country is highlighted in red, it means that it's clearly worse off. And if it's highlighted in green, it means clearly better off. Now, V-Dem's data is based on a global expert survey, which is updated annually and asks over 100 different questions. It also contains indices that are measured not through the expert survey, but through documents and information which doesn't require such level of expertise. Now, these over 100 indicators are then aggregated into domain-specific mid-level indices. By domains, I mean domains such as elections, media, or civil society. And finally, they are also aggregated to some top-level indices, such as indices of electoral democracy or liberal democracy. Now, on the top left, you see the state of electoral democracy as measured by V-Dem, and we see that Poland and Hungary are doing clearly worse off than they were 21 years ago. But then if we look, if we move to the right, to the top right figure, we see that rule of law is something that maybe is more specific to Poland and Hungary than to some of the other countries of the region. So they are clearly worse off. And yes, this is something that attracts a lot of attention, but it's not the whole picture. Now, if we move to the bottom row to the left, we see one of these mid-level indices, a freedom of expression index, which includes things like freedom of the media, and so on. And we see that it's not only Poland and Hungary that are now clearly worse off than they were 20 years ago, but now also Croatia and Slovenia are highlighted in red, in the sense that they are clearly worse off than they were. And finally, I picked one of the many low-level indices, which is one that relates to the deliberative domain, so to the domain of deliberative democracy, which is a question on how are counter-arguments approached in deliberating public decisions. And we see that, again, Hungary and Poland are clearly worse off than they were 21 years ago, but again, Slovenia, just like with the freedom of expression, is now highlighted in that, but also Estonia. And we also see that Slovakia, Lithuania, Czechia, and Croatia are doing worse off, but not as clearly as the countries highlighted in red. Yes, that is, in short, the picture that I would like to give. Of course, I mean, it's very easy to make figures like these on V-Dem's website for any of the hundreds of indices, and one can also choose different year comparisons. So maybe 2010 is a more interesting baseline than 2020. At the same time, I chose this to, let's say, zoom out and give a broader picture.
Many thanks, Juraj, and especially many thanks for observing the time limits. So when we come to the questions of policy relevance, I think there is hardly any other democracy measuring project that is attacked as often in autocratizing countries in Central and Eastern Europe as Freedom House, which is demonstrating that democracy measuring has a special relevance, at least in the domestic scene of countries suffering under democratic decline. Zselyke, how do you see this disconnection of the European political narrative from your findings and domestic narratives in these countries? Is the lack of policy relevance at EU level a problem, or just a matter of fact, democracy measuring projects have to simply live with? You have the floor.
Thank you. And I think already in your question, you sort of pointed to this disconnect between the two, because I think we can say that I don't think we can say that these indices have lost their policy relevance. So I would like to first just push back a little bit on that, because I think that that on the one hand, they still have the discursive hegemony, if you will. Last year, I think we saw that with Freedom House's index, when in Politico Europe, it was the most non-COVID related, most read non-COVID related article, the one that was about the report and about the fact that Hungary is no longer a democracy. So I do think that that these indices still have influence. I think, yes, that's a different question, to what extent they are able to influence the policy discussion and the policy debate. And I think at the same time, Freedom House's index and V-Dem, as well as the BTI, they are being used by policymakers in the US and in the Commission as well. So we can't say that they are completely irrelevant. I think what you might, what your question might be pointing at more is that why is it that these indices are being questioned more and more? Why is that happening? And I would just sort of take a step back and say that from a broader perspective, that is obvious, because we have seen significant shifts in the global international sphere over the past decade or more. So the hegemony that was led by the international liberal, quote unquote, liberal order, the US-led hegemony is being eroded, and there is an ideological contestation ongoing. And I think this is something that was perhaps more present, or has been much more present in Central Asia and Eurasia earlier. And what I mean by that is that you have seen gongos everywhere appear. You have seen international election monitoring organizations that come up with their own findings. So you have all of these parallel bodies appearing. And this is something that is just coming to Central Europe and the Balkans. I mean, gongoization has been around for some time, so that's not necessarily new, but it's becoming more prominent in this region as well. And I think you see also with the appearance of these institutes, these journals that discuss the constitutional changes or the legal changes in Poland and Hungary, you sort of see a norm setting happening or taking place in these countries. And at the same time, I think one thing that I would point out about these new institutions is that that these attempts are often ideologically hollow. They don't necessarily have a separate ideology. Often they don't have a separate ideology, but they copy the form. So they use the same form, or often just say that we don't agree with the current understanding of the rule of law. There is no such thing as the rule of law because there isn't an agreement on that. So we define the rule of law as we wish. But it still refers to the previous liberal, define it as you will, understanding of these concepts. So I think, I don't think we should be wishing for an era where these things are unchanged. These are developments that are well beyond our power. I think as organizations that publish these indices, what we should make sure is that we clarify what it is that our indices evaluate or measure, that it's absolutely clear to those who are challenging the findings, and that we also just make it clear that these methodologies have been unchanged. So it's not us who are changing. It's those who are contesting it are saying that this is no longer valid. And then of course, I mean, politics will use these as everything has been much more politicized by now. Politics will use these indices for its own purposes as well. So in that regard, I think as organizations, what we can do is just recognize that as a challenge and understand it.
Thank you so much, Zselyke, and thank you for pushing back. Of course, my question was provocative, and I belong to the very last persons who would like to question the relevance of democracy measuring. I still would like to stick to the point that, of course, it's not surprising that those whom the democracy measuring reports are shedding a bad light are contesting the findings. But I think it's still a very big and open question why EU politics and even EU stakeholders, who definitely, as you mentioned, are using the documents, are refraining from embracing the discourse of autocratization and democratic decline. The whole discursive construct of the rule of law crisis is the depoliticization of this narrative, and an attempt to hold the discussion on a technocratic level, which is depoliticized. But of course, we shouldn't discuss it now in details. We can come back into the Q&A round to that. But thank you so much for your take. Ms. Donner, BTI is often perceived as the policy crown jewel of Germany democracy assistance. However, German foreign policy and the the German EU policy discourse is also very distant from your findings when it comes to the quality of democracy and good governance in CEE. So if I may put my finger in the wound of this discrepancy again, do you see a sort of disconnection of German policymakers from the realities and among others also your findings?
Thank you. Not sure if I'm the person to answer this. Yes, I do see, and I'm not sure if it is a particular German problem or if it is an inner European problem per se, and some of the things I mentioned earlier might explain some of it, not to excuse them. The reaction of, if you are talking about policy relevance, then the next step would be, okay, what do we do about it? And I think we were ill-prepared. Germany as well as others, we are ill-prepared to deal with these gradual changes and shifting patterns within our own societies and within the European Union. Yes, there have been, there are very strong mechanisms actually, but I think they are not really intended, they were not really created with the intention to counter this gradual change once you are a member of the European Union, because again, maybe failure of imagination or wishful thinking, we didn't expect that to happen. So one of the reasons for the lack of not necessarily awareness, I feel, and I joined Csáky in her observation, we observe, I don't know, more awareness, way more awareness of these topics, even if they are contested. It is more discussed than it has been 10 years ago. And we were struggling in, getting people to listen seriously. The quality of democracy matters for a lot of very very relevant policy areas as well. So that has changed. There is, I think, awareness. There is discussion, and I welcome this discussion. And probably the contestation that we feel, again, also in that regard, I think the complacency of the European Union as in general did not let us detect that there is also a strategy and a political strategy behind that, behind contesting the current agenda without offering, like you said, without offering any ideological picture, but if there's no counteraction, if we are not managing to actually consolidate our stand of defending democracy, there's just a vacuum where these contestations without substance are the things that we hear. And I hope that is going to change. I'm not happy with all in all with the results yet, but I think we are at least hopefully seeing some mechanisms being developed that will make that, accept the reality that discretion can happen, and we have to have more granular instruments to fight that, and a more decisive stand in entering this, like you mentioned it, entering this narration battle. I think we have been basically leaning back in the decade, and we're coming to the table now, and that this is not true for Germany alone. Hopefully the Europeans will all get that together. And let's not forget, there's a lot of, and that is also something that is maybe not policy relevance, but there's an impact within the countries of and we shouldn't underestimate that. We hear that a lot. I'm sure Freedom House hears it a lot in V-Dem as well. It's particularly when there is no pushback from, other countries or the international community, having these external observations, reports, data in hand is something that is strengthening and helping the remaining opposition and remaining civil society actors within the countries as well.
Thank you so much, Ms. Donner. Juraj, V-Dem defines themselves as a more or less purely academic project engaged at the field of basic research. What role do policy relevance or policy impact play in your consideration, if they play a role at all? Over to you.
Yes, thank you, Daniel. Well, I mean, so it's absolutely correct. V-Dem is hosted, the V-Dem Institute is hosted at the University of Gothenburg, and it's a part of the Department of Political Science. So, yes, I mean, our concerns are maybe more academic than of the other democracy measuring projects. But let me share another set of figures with you that maybe illustrate one feature that we hope helps policymakers to get more out of our data. So as I've mentioned before, most of the information in the V-Dem dataset comes from an expert survey. And this expert survey contains questions where the respondents have to choose from a predefined set of answers. Here we have so in the top left panel, we have an example of this. The vertical dimension indicates some latent trait of a country at a particular point in time that we wish to measure, and each column represents a different expert. Now, we see that we may get different answers from these three hypothetical experts for the same value on the latent scale, right? In other words, yes, sometimes experts do disagree. Now, why do they disagree? That's illustrated with the diagram on the top right, which is, well, so the answers that we observe are a function of two things: the true value, which we usually cannot observe directly, and then some noise. Right? So something that maybe steers the attention of the rater away, but in an unbiased way, from the true unobserved, the value that we do not observe, but they are aware of. And then finally, the experts may disagree with where they place the thresholds between the response categories that are there. Now, using a complex methodology that combines survey design and statistical modeling, we use this to provide uncertainty estimates attached to our point estimates. So in the bottom left, we see one of the indices that I've shown before, now for 4 selected countries in a time series of 20 years. And the shaded areas indicate the uncertainty that is attached to these estimates. Right? Now, this sort of uncertainty then propagates to the mid-level and high-level indices, such as the Electoral Democracy Index here, in the sense that then they also have some intervals attached to the point estimates, right? And I mean, very informally speaking, our experience has been that policymakers do find that useful. For example, looking here at Hungary, we would see that, well, I mean, there's still some chance that the value of the Electoral Democracy Index could be above 0.5, but most of the evidence puts it below that particular point on the scale.
Thank you so much, Juraj, and thank you for this take on plausibility. I think it's very important from a methodological perspective. At this point, I would like to open up the Q&A. So ladies and gentlemen, please feel free to submit your questions via the Q&A or the chat function. I hope that we will have time for at least 2 question rounds, and we already have a couple of questions, and I would like to bunch together 4. 2 are smaller questions addressed to Zselyke. One is that what exactly is measured under the National Democratic Governance Index. And the second one that you mentioned, that the democratic decline of Hungary already started before 2010, and whether you could elaborate a bit more on that part. And we have 2 bit more detailed and longer questions / remarks by Marlene Wind and Markus Hau. And I don't know whether you would like to ask your question in person, because in that case, I would unmute you. And first, Professor Wind, just give me a second. I unmuted you. Please unmute yourself and introduce yourself and ask your question.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this wonderful opportunity and really interesting seminar. Yeah, my question is coming out of a more kind of philosophical debate that's been recently among sociologists, philosophers, and so on about using the word democracy when defining these countries. I think that when we discuss impacting politics, it really doesn't help very much when you have these institutions like Bertelsmann Stiftung, which continues to pretend that we are in fact talking about democracies. What is your reflection on that? I mean, and this is to Ms. Donner, that is it some kind of political correctness that you keep using this word and pretending you are talking about democracies, or is it, yeah, why are you doing it? I mean, it really is, I think, problematic to and also confusing when other indices do not use that word anymore at a certain point. You can see that with Freedom House, but also V-Dem. So what is your reflection on that? Is this something that is imposed from political from politics, that you should keep pretending you're talking about democracies by talking about defecting democracies or highly defecting democracies? Does that even make sense anymore? Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Professor Wind. And Markus, you have the floor.
Thanks, Daniel. Yeah, so my question concerned in particular a reflection on Austria, which, depending on your definition, falls outside of the CE region. But in the EU's recent annual rule of law reports, Austria ranked third among the surveyed states in terms of the amount of times that concerns and serious concerns was used. I think part of this was to do with the fact that the monitoring mechanisms have been expanded. So in a way, it was shedding light on problems that have been sort of in Austria for a very long time now. There hasn't been a deterioration per se. This is just part of the Austrian institutional model. And as such, I think that these kind of reports, these measurements often require qualitative analysis. They require contextualization. Of course, one of the problems with becoming qualitative in analysis is that you very quickly lay yourself open to the charge of being political, which is already the case with the measures anyway. So I suppose the question, it was more of a comment than a question, but if there is to be a question, it's to what extent it's useful to include qualitative analysis to contextualize these measurements, and to what extent is that possible? Thanks.
Thank you, Markus. And probably we can go now in reverse order. Juraj, would you like to address some of the questions?
Well, maybe very generally the question about using labels such as democracy and autocracy. So, I mean, there's, I guess what's behind, what's the question, what's the concern behind this question is, you know, if we have the option to offer the data at different levels of resolution, let's say a scale that goes from 0 to 10, or something that's more that has fewer categories that are maybe more clearly separated. And I mean, very generally, so the answer to that, of course, always depends on the audience, right? Like, because if we go from a more detailed scale to a less detailed scale, from a scale with more points to a scale with fewer points, we will always leave out some information. And sometimes leaving out information can help the audience to process that information, but sometimes it can make it more difficult to process that information. I mean, so that's why on our end, we offer all of these and then much more in the data. I mean, it always depends on the audience.
Thank you so much, Juraj. Ms. Donna?
Yes, just to that as well, because you addressed me personally. One of the points is maybe I presented misleadingly that we only have democracies in the BTI in 137 countries. Of course, there are autocracies. This is not, there's no political correctness in that. Quite the opposite. You can be either a democracy or autocracy in the BTI. And we have decided for methodological reasons that we stick to that dichotomy and not have an in-between area, gray zone that actually exists. So the notion, and I'm sure my colleagues will agree, the notion which country is no longer a democracy, and you know, the cutting off edge when you declare that is something that is not a precise science, and we shouldn't sort of give the impression it would be. There are gray zones in between, and we have to decide that. And we are very careful, Zselyke mentioned, that they are being, Freedom House is criticized because they are not reacting, you know, too quickly or quickly enough when it comes to the categorization as an autocracy. The other point is vice versa would be true as well. To your larger philosophical question, though, I think that I agree with your premise that it is for the narrative sometimes not helpful to call something still a democracy, because that is the notion that people then have of what a democracy should be. And in those cases, it isn't. In those cases that would be in the BTI, highly defective democracies, in the nations in transit, hybrid regimes. So that this is something that is up to discussion, and it's not a precise sort of science. But I do think you are right in the fact that we really have to reflect on how we are one of the narrators in this narrative, the indices. And it's something that is, of course, political. And that maybe just quickly to the second question. Yeah, qualitative analysis tends to have to counter the argument that it is politicized or political, or even subjective. I don't think that quantitative data are not political and not subjective. By choosing what you are measuring, you are being actually, even if it is all methodological sound, you are choosing indicators and also quantitative indicators that you measure in order to show progress. And I think we can, with our reporting, we are trying to have a discussion and debate. We are actually having various authors working on that. We are having a code book to have standards, etc. So we're trying to reduce subjectivity. You can never completely rule that out. But again, also being very philosophical here, I don't think that numbers are neutral. So, and we choose not to be. It is, the BTI is a normative index, and we are being very transparent about that. So everyone who thinks there is no rule of law and there should not be one, can have that opinion and probably won't like our reporting and our ratings.
Thank you so much, Ms. Donner. As we will definitely have time for a second question round, I would like to encourage you, ladies and gentlemen, to submit your questions. And yes, the event will be recorded, as some of the participants are asking that on the chat, and will be available either tonight or tomorrow at the YouTube channel of the German Marshall Fund. But having said that, over to you, Zselyke. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you. And yes, I would like to very much just second what Sabine was saying, that numbers are not neutral either. And I think it's very important to explain what they are measuring, and we are staking out a position by doing that. That's not really a choice, unfortunately, but we have to be clear about that. There is this book by Alex Cooley and Jack Snyder, ranking the world, I believe, which sort of has some recommendations to these indices, some best practices, and the most important thing there is just to state what you are evaluating or measuring. And so, as I said previously, everything is becoming political at this point. So there is no escaping that anymore. On just briefly tackling the two questions, the small ones that were asked. So national democratic governance in our index, that is the indicator that evaluates mostly centralization of power in the hands of the government, transparency of governance, and then, I mean, after a point, it evaluates personalization of power in autocratic regimes. On Hungary's score declining before 2010, so that was the result of actually political polarization in Hungary, which made an appearance maybe much earlier than in other countries, or was prominent earlier than in other countries, already after the first Fidesz government in the late 1990s, early 2000s. But on nations in transit, so on this report, Hungary started declining around 2005, And it is related to the police violence, for example, in 2006. And afterwards, just the economic crisis and the government's handling of that. But you can look up these reports from the past. And then perhaps just two quick points to what Marlene was saying. And I think one of the participants asked here in the questions as well, not just, like, we should be careful not just about democracy and the use of that word, but also when it comes to backsliding. And this is that we are trying to do more and more. We are trying to pay attention that what we are seeing, at least in Hungary and Poland, is more than backsliding. It is an autocratization attempt. And I think, again, that's just something that we should be clear about going forward, because that's important. And then one additional comment to Marcus's question or comment on the rule of law report. I think for that report, and I'm not alone in saying this, others have said this as well, that the Commission should have been clearer in setting out not just a qualitative analysis, but some kind of recommendations on the one hand, which would be very important. So which are the areas that need to be tackled? And then perhaps also, if not scores, then just some kind of comparative that would be helpful for people. I think I tackled all the questions that were directed to me.
Exactly. Thank you, Zselyke, and many thanks for your comment on democratic decline and autocratization. I know that's not a benchmark, but by the German Marshall Fund, we try to use the word autocratization in this context just to signalize that it's not a spontaneous process what is happening in these countries. We have plenty of time for our last question round, and I think we could proceed in a similar manner. I will bunch together two smaller questions and probably give the floor for 2 or 4 participants to comment or ask in person. The two smaller questions practically to all of you is that we touched upon the issue that a recovery from state capture can be painful and slow. Zselyke mentioned the example of North Macedonia, and our participants are asking whether a similar pattern is expected after the last elections in the case of Montenegro. It's a bit speculative and belongs rather in the category of foresight, but if you could take the question and answer or react on it, we would be grateful. And the second question goes into the direction between this dialogue discrepancy between the European Union and the domestic discourse in the autocratizing countries. And because I think we cannot speak in the name of the European institutions, I would like to reformulate the questions. What is the right policy approach, in your opinion, from your part, from the part of the democracy measuring projects? Should you or do you react on the discursive contestation of the projects? Or probably the best strategy is from your part, leaving these discursive attempts a part of the Hungarian or other autocratizing governments simply unanswered. And concerning our participants, I would like to ask Anniko Gregor whether she would like to make her critique on the policy relevance of the democracy measuring projects in person. But if you would like, Anniko, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I guess that my comment was touched by the speaker, so I don't want to push this topic further. I totally agree with the panelists that rankings are political, and they are creating, or they are creating different geopolitical regions morally different. Like, oh, these countries are the democracies, the great countries, the good ones, and there are the others who who are backsliding, as you said, or countries that are not that good in terms of fulfilling the different requirements to be called as a democracy. But this question was touched, so I don't want to push it further. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aniko. And then, last but not least, I would like to ask Regica Rolfing whether she would like to ask her question in person.
Yes, thank you so much for letting me have the floor. My question has maybe also been touched upon a little bit, but it is whether or not you all representing different indices might see a need for having a bit more consensus on the way that you're working. I mean, you have different methods for how you do your indices and for when you're categorizing something as democratic and not, which sometimes may lead to a case where countries such as Hungary and Poland or other countries that are engaging in this autocratization or backsliding, what we want to call it, can then just point to one of the other indices that still says that they are democratic and say, well, there's no problem here because others still find us democratic. But it also maybe lead to that institutions like the EU then has no common momentum from where they can act based on saying that there's no agreement on whether these countries are actually engaging in backsliding on autocratization. So is there not some kind of a need for consensus among the different measurement indices to have more agreement on when is something democratic and how can we actually talk about it, especially when we're saying that indices are not political, they are political and not just neutral. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ms. Rolfing. And probably we could start this round with Ms. Donner. Ms. Donner, you have the floor.
Thank you. Addressing the last question first, is there more need for consensus? You see us here sitting as complementing friendly competitors here. I think, at least if I have to say it, I embrace every new indicator set that comes around actually, or is trying to monitor democracy. If you're looking at the core questions of when is a country a democracy or not, I think we would more or less be in agreement. And there are nuances when we decide to do that, to actually say that countries over the has been pushed over that level in one or the other direction. The problem is, as nice as it would be that we have a worldwide consensus on what exactly are the indicators that make for democracy or autocracy and the qualitative steps in between. I don't see an institution that could do such an exercise that would be credible. We get a lot of feedback from the international organizations who have to sort of have no political mandate. They are glad that there is a political debate on these issues because they have to be more on the technocratic side. So I think the ranking and rating exercise, and you see the trends that we presented in the region were more or less all the same with some differences, but they were not deviating to an extent that that the country could use that. If I judge by the reaction of the Hungarian government that we get, it is not very friendly and not using us for an excuse that we are still presenting them as democratic. So I'm not really sure if a consensus can be reached. I think every indicator set adds to the discussion and the important discussion that we have to have, making sure that this is a ongoing debate. That constitutes a highly consolidated democracy? What are the elements that are needed, and at what time are we alarmed? So I embrace the multiple exercises that there are actually. The contestation that happens, actually, the question is, you should be engaged in that. The question is, what is the intent of the contestation? If it is to have an open debate, about the quality of democracy, we are all game, we are all in. Usually, that's not the intent. The intent is to defame and to sort of I mean, there is no sort of other view but the negative and the contestation. So usually we are not reacting to those where the intent is just to defame us. But we are happily, and as you can see already, there are some very, philosophical questions that we like to engage in, and that we, I think, discuss internally a lot as well. What is our role in this debate, etc., etc. That always happens when someone is contesting a specific result.
Thank you so much, Ms. Donner. Juraj, would you like to jump in?
Yes, thank you, Daniel. So first, I will lump together the question of more indices and measuring regimes on very coarse categorical scale, such as the 2-point scale of democracy, autocracy. So perhaps my answer will come across as very academic, but I think like more data is always better in two senses. It's always better to have multiple measurements done by different people using different methodologies. And I'm sure not only academics, but also policymakers appreciate it at some level. And the other is that more data is also better if we're talking about a single index, in the sense that if we do not prematurely aggregate or reduce a more complex scale to a simpler scale, then we're always better off. So I think the whole debate can be more productive if we focus away from the issue where exactly to place the threshold between democracy and autocracy, and rather look at a more detailed picture of, okay, did the country change in the past 10 years? How much? Are there any comparable cases? If so, where they are and what to do about them, or what was done about them, where are they now, right? And the other question that, well, let me share my screen and answer also one of the other questions, which is, well, so what's the future for countries that have experienced decline in democracy? Well, so there's two aspects to this. One is what to do, right, which is a political question ultimately, and the other is a question that's more academic, which is, well, how likely is that to happen without us engaging with it or affecting it in any way? And V-Dem now offers also two extensions of the V-Dem data set, which you can see here. One is for predicting adverse regime transitions, so changes away from democracy. And the other offers also some forecasts on openings, so moves towards more democracy. And you can see many things there, so I will not show them, but we do have these tools. And of course, I mean, forecasting is a more difficult task than just measuring something that can already be observed. But I hope that it's documented well enough for any audience to be able to make use of these scores and to have an understanding of how they were generated and what assumptions are embodied in them.
Thank you so much, Juraj. Zselyke, over to you.
Thank you. And yes, I mean, I completely agree with Juraj and Sabine that more indices is good in a sense that we need more nuance, we need more details. So as long as we can discuss the details and not necessarily, as Juraj was also saying, what is happening on the cusp and why is that relevant, I think we have a discussion that is more fruitful, that results in perhaps more agreement as well. To Regis' question that indices are being used against each other, I think that happens. I think today we have seen that there is just a very significant, the three indices that we presented today agree in their conclusions, but governments will still pick and choose and use them against each other if they want to. I think at the same time, maybe I was not clear when I was talking about the fact that everything is becoming political. I think as organizations, we can't really embrace that. Don't misunderstand me. I did not meant to embrace that being political. Unfortunately, we are being pushed into a corner where it's very difficult to talk about the details themselves because we are being portrayed as political actors. And so in terms of what we can do about that, I think I would just go back to what I was saying, is that just restating that this is what we are evaluating, these are the criteria, this is the process, this has been unchanged, and then just answering any questions that come up. And then to the final question about Montenegro, I mean, we don't do forecasting, but it's certainly one of the countries that we will be looking at, especially because in that country the change comes after 3 decades. So it's a very long time. In Kosovo's case, it's of course a shorter time period. In Bulgaria's case, an even shorter time period. And there are differences between those 3. I think what we will be looking at in Montenegro's case, it's too early to tell what's going on, but what we will be looking at is what happens at the institutional level, because these are captured institutions or were captured institutions. And did not have an independent version. And so I think that's also maybe a warning to Poland and Hungary and any other countries that are going in this direction, that once you are in the hybrid regime category in nations in transit, and once these institutions become so politicized, it's very difficult to get back to baseline. It's very difficult to get back to a common understanding. And there will always be parties will always be attracted to just capturing these institutions and using them for their own purposes. So we will be, paying close attention to what's happening in Montenegro and in the other countries as well.
Thank you so much, Becca. We are approaching the end of the webinar, but I think we still have time for a final closing round for closing statements. And I just would like to put one really provocative question on the table. Please feel free to react on it or completely disregard it in your closing statements. And I would like to touch upon the point what Juraj made, that of course we shouldn't look on the categorizations first of all and the final figures, but much more on the fine-grained details and on the trends. And mentioning the trends, several democracy measuring projects have methodological limitations when it comes to the degree of downscoring, which is possible from the yearly published or from year to year in the measuring process. And having said that, would you agree with the statements that in this regard, practically most democracy measuring projects offer a rather optimistic view on the situation of democracy in Poland and Hungary? Because it's simply not possible in certain cases to downgrade these countries in a pace due to these methodological limitations, which would be justified otherwise based by the qualitative analysis. As I mentioned, take it or leave it, but please, you have the floor for your closing statements. Ms. Donner, would you mind to start?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for all the great and inspiring and stimulating questions, actually, even though sometimes we fall short of giving you the final answers. I think what I would be most interested in doing is going beyond the numbers, also talking about policy relevance in the sense of what do we do with democracy promotion, and I'm hesitating to even use that word. That means that it is becoming problematic. What do we do with the alliance of people sharing the values in sort of pinpointing and directing some of the instruments that we have more closely to what is happening here. And that doesn't exclude Western countries or non. I think the debate is ongoing. I would be very, very interested in your one of the questions that you asked in the first panel, in an answer by PTI only reaches back to 2003-06. But the historical perspective, whether there is any case where state capture to the degree that we are seeing now has been reversed successfully, and what we could learn from that. Just a final remark on your last question. I think it theoretically it is possible to downgrade. What sort of are the limitations is that if you have a global comparative effort, then yes, the situation of freedom and assembly rights in, let's say, Poland is better than that in North Korea, and there has to be some sort of measure to distinguish that. So it's a matter of perspective, of time series perspective. There are some people arguing that, we're seeing here, if you're looking back in 100 years, that will be some sort of irrelevant fluctuation in the big picture. If you're looking back to the 1900s, then of course the trajectory of democracies is a successful story, etc., etc. But again, I think it would be worth, yes, going deeper into the details, but also coming up with, I think that's a political decision as well. Do we want to do we have the means and instruments to counteract these trends more effectively than we are currently doing it? When we are talking about external support, going beyond the region development aid, etc., etc. And I think that's something that we have to come up with better solutions than we are currently having.
Thank you so much, Ms. Donner. Juraj, your closing remarks, please.
Yes, thank you, Daniel. So with regards to the question about Poland and Hungary and whether maybe the picture given by V-Dem is more optimistic than what it should be, I wouldn't say that is the case, because V-Dem, when it's updated every spring, updates also the previous scores, in the sense that when we add new observations, we take into account the previous observations and how the new observations relate to them. Plus, it is also possible that some scores can be changed retroactively as new information comes up. And in the case of Hungary, we had now a decade of this, several cycles, and the trend just continues, especially if you look at the Electoral Democracy Index. It's not like it would be something that would go up and down with fits and starts. It's rather a steady decline that we observe over many updates of the data. And with Poland, we now had also several years, several rounds of this, and it doesn't look like we would need to revise the current scores much in the near future. That's my reading. It may, of course, happen as new information comes up, right? Because our indices measure also things that are difficult to observe directly, especially as they're going on. Yes. Well, I mean, so that also applies to the question about whether there are limits to downgrading. So, I mean, the way the methodology set up doesn't really cause this. So if, for example, you have some extreme event like an extra legal, extra constitutional takeover of government, it will show up very quickly as a massive downgrade. So the methodology is set up so that it's sensitive to events like this, which also means that it's quite sensitive to smaller moves downwards as well.
Thank you, Juraj. Zselyke?
Thank you. Yeah, I would also, agreeing with Juraj, I would also push back that we are taking the optimistic view, because I think the data speaks for itself. What you saw at the beginning, what I presented, is just that the extent of the change has been much bigger in Central Europe and in Poland and Hungary than anything that we have ever seen in the Nations in Transit survey. So yes, we can be criticized for being slow, but I do think at the same time that there is a larger danger in being too trigger happy, if I should say. I think if there's one lesson that we have learned from Hungary's case, that it takes time to dismantle a democracy. It takes a very, very long time, and I think that is what these indices show. And then at the same time, I would just like to reiterate that that our findings and the findings of V-Dem and BTI simply speak to the urgency of the situation. So our hope is really just that that policymakers will use this, will recognize it, because our role is really to inform the public about what's going on and to inform policymakers about what the developments are and which are the areas that need special focus and special attention. But then ultimately, of course, I mean, it is up to the citizens of each of these countries to change their governments. So this is not our role, but I think what we do here is just present a picture that I hope has been helpful, and I hope will be even more helpful in the future to policymakers.
Thank you so much. I think that was a perfect closing phrase. And at that point, I would like to say a big, big thank you for you all for this extremely insightful discussion. I hope you also enjoyed it. And many thanks for you, ladies and gentlemen, for your attention and participation. I just very briefly would like to announce our next event, what will take place on the 28th of April. And we will dig into the details of informal power and the role of informal power in Poland and Hungary. Have a nice afternoon and hopefully see you next time. Goodbye.